The locksmith was already at the front door when I pulled into the driveway, and my aunt had been dead for 11 days. He was a young guy in a Carhartt jacket with a ring of picks clipped to his belt, and he was kneeling on the welcome mat she'd kept since before I was born, the one with the faded sunflower and the burn mark from the cigarette my Uncle Pete dropped in 1997. He looked up when he heard my tires on the gravel. He said, "You the niece?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Sorry for your loss." He had the deadbolt out of the door in 90 seconds. The chain came next. Then the small brass lock on the inside knob that my Aunt Doreen had installed herself the year I turned 14. He handed me 3 keys on a paperclip ring. He said, "House is yours now." Then he packed up his case and drove off in a white van with a phone number on the side. And I stood alone on the porch of the house I had grown up in. The wind moved the chimes she'd hung in the maple. The mail slot still had her name stenciled above it in green paint, Doreen Whitlock. The name I had carried until I was 17 years old and learned in the front office of a community college that it had never legally been mine. Welcome back to Broken Relations. If you are new here, we share stories about families, secrets, and the quiet people who finally start asking questions. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. My name is Margaret. I am 34 years old. I run a small bakery on a side street in a town in eastern Ohio, 2.5 hours from where I grew up. I sell sourdough on Tuesdays and Thursdays, cinnamon rolls on Saturdays, and a maple loaf at Christmas that has a 6-week waiting list. My apartment is above the bakery. I have a cat named Pearl and a record player that belonged to my Aunt Doreen, and 47 cookbooks I have written notes in the margins of. I have a quiet life. I built it myself, board by board, the way Doreen taught me. And until 11 days ago, I believed I was the daughter of a woman named Elaine Whitlock, who had died of an overdose in a motel bathroom in Cleveland when I was 11 years old, and that my Aunt Doreen had taken me in out of obligation and grief and a kind of grim Whitlock loyalty. That is the story I had carried for 23 years. It was not the story. Aunt Doreen died on a Tuesday in October. Heart. She was 71. She had been alone in the kitchen of the farmhouse on Birchwood Road. The neighbor, a man named Carl, who plowed her driveway in winter and brought her tomatoes in summer, found her the next morning when he came by with a jar of pickled beets and saw her car still parked at the angle she always parked it. The funeral was on a Saturday. I stood at the front of the small Lutheran church in a black dress I had bought the day before at a department store off the interstate. I read a poem she had marked in one of her books. People I did not know hugged me and told me she had loved me very much. I knew that part. I had never doubted it. The thing I had doubted was whether she had loved me as a niece or as a duty. And the answer to that question was sitting in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of her desk in the back bedroom. And I would not open that drawer for another 6 days. Aunt Doreen never married. That was the simplest true sentence I knew about her. She had been engaged once in her 20s to a man named Robert who worked for the railroad, and he had died of a stroke at 31 in a way that nobody in the family ever fully explained. And after that, she had built a life out of small, competent acts. She owned the farmhouse outright. She kept chickens, then stopped keeping chickens, then kept them again. She drove a 1998 Buick LeSabre that ran like a sewing machine. She baked. She read mystery novels with cracked spines. She subscribed to 2 newspapers and read both of them front to back at the kitchen table every morning with a yellow highlighter in her hand. She wore men's flannel shirts in the winter and cotton button-downs in the summer, and a single pair of small gold hoop earrings that had belonged to her mother. She was the calmest person I had ever known, and from the time I was 11 years old until I left for community college at 18, she was the only person in the world who had ever truly looked at me. The story I had been told went like this. My mother, Elaine Whitlock, was Doreen's younger sister by 9 years. Elaine had run wild in high school, gotten pregnant at 22, never named the father, and moved through a series of apartments in Cleveland with a child she could not really care for. Doreen had visited when she could. Elaine had been on and off various substances for a decade. The motel bathroom was the end of a long, sad arc. And after the funeral, Doreen had driven down to Cleveland in the LeSabre, packed me in a black trash bag of my belongings into the passenger seat, and brought me home to Birchwood Road. That was the story. I had heard it in pieces from neighbors, in fragments from a school counselor who took me aside in 7th grade, in a single late-night sentence from my Uncle Pete before he himself died of cancer the year I turned 16. Doreen herself had never told it to me directly. When I was 9 and 12 and 15 and asked her questions about my mother, she would set down whatever she was doing, her highlighter, her wooden spoon, her knitting, and she would look at me with a steadiness that was almost unbearable. And she would say, "Margaret, your mother loved you the best she could. The rest of it is not for now." And I would nod, because Doreen did not lie, and Doreen did not bend, and Doreen was the only safe ground I had ever stood on. I drove home from the funeral with a cardboard box of casseroles and the front door key in my coat pocket. I did not go into the back bedroom that night. I did not even go upstairs. I slept on the couch in the living room, under the afghan she had crocheted the year I started high school, and in the morning, I made coffee in her percolator and sat at the kitchen table and read both of her newspapers and cried for the first time since the phone call from Carl. I cried until the coffee was cold. Then I got up and washed the cup and put it in the drying rack the way she had taught me, and I started going through the house. For 5 days, I did the easy rooms, the kitchen, the pantry, the mudroom, the downstairs closet with the coats and the boots, and the cardboard box of Christmas ornaments she had labeled in her steady, looping hand. I made a pile for donation. I made a pile for keeping. I made a third pile for the dump, which stayed mostly empty because Doreen did not keep things that did not deserve to be kept. On the 6th day, I went into the back bedroom. The back bedroom had been her office. It had a desk under the window and a filing cabinet beside the desk and a bookshelf along the back wall and a single small armchair where she sat in the evenings to read when the kitchen was too warm. The desk was oak and heavy and had 4 drawers. The top 3 were what you would expect: pens, stamps, a checkbook ledger she kept by hand, a small tin of paper clips. The bottom drawer was locked. I sat on the floor in front of it for a long time. I knew about the bottom drawer. Doreen had kept it locked my entire childhood. When I was 8, I had asked her once what was in it, and she had said, "Old paperwork, Margaret, nothing interesting." And I had believed her. because I had no reason not to, and because at 8 years old, you do not know yet that adults sometimes lie to keep you safe and sometimes lie to keep themselves safe. And the difference between the two is the difference between a roof and a cage. I went back to the kitchen. I opened the small ceramic jar by the stove where she kept her keys. There were 5 keys in it. 4 of them I recognized. The 5th was small and brass and had a piece of masking tape wrapped around its head with a single word written on it in her hand. Desk. The drawer slid open clean. Inside were 3 things: a green accordion file, expanded and worn at the edges, labeled in her writing with a single letter, M. A small wooden box about the size of a paperback book, and a sealed white envelope on top of everything else, addressed in her hand, to Margaret. Open first. I took the envelope out to the kitchen. I sat at the table where I had eaten 17 years of breakfast. I slit the seal with a butter knife. The letter inside was 3 pages. Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry that I am not there to walk you through any of it. I have been a coward, and I have been a coward for 23 years, and the only thing I can tell you is that every day I made the choice over again, and every day I made it for what I believed was the right reason, even when the reason changed shape on me. The papers in this drawer will tell you most of it. I want to tell you some of it myself first, in my own words, because you deserve at least that much. Margaret, I am not your aunt. Elaine Whitlock was not your mother. Your mother's name was Caroline Beaumont, and she did not die in a motel bathroom in Cleveland. She is, as far as I know, still alive. She lives in a town called Asheville in North Carolina. She gave you up when you were 3 months old. She gave you up to me. I want you to read the rest of what is in that drawer before you decide what to do with this information. And I want you to know that I loved you the way a mother loves a daughter, and I have never once thought of you as anything else. Doreen. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The sun moved across the floor. Pearl, who had come with me from Ohio in a carrier, jumped up on the chair across from me and watched me with her yellow eyes. I read the letter 3 times. Then I went back to the back bedroom and I brought the green accordion file out to the kitchen and I opened it on the table in front of me and I started at the beginning. The accordion file was organized the way Doreen organized everything, chronologically, with dividers, with notes paper-clipped to the relevant documents in her steady hand. The first divider was labeled 1990. Inside it was a single document, 2 pages long, titled Voluntary Termination of Parental Rights and Consent to Adoption, State of North Carolina, Buncombe County. The relinquishing parent was listed as Caroline Ann Beaumont, age 19. The receiving parent was listed as Doreen Margaret Whitlock, age 37. The infant was listed as Margaret Caroline Beaumont, female, born March 14th, 1990, weight 6 pounds, 4 ounces. The signatures had been notarized on June 8th, 1990. I had been 3 months old. I want to stop here for a second. If you have ever read a sentence in your own handwriting that did not match the version of yourself you had been carrying, you know the kind of silence that follows. Drop a comment if this is hitting close, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do. The next part is where it gets harder. The second divider was labeled 1990 also. Inside it was a small stack of letters in handwriting I did not recognize, all addressed to Doreen at the Birchwood Road address. The earliest one was dated April 2nd, 1990. The handwriting was looping and young and careful, and the salutation read, "Dear Aunt Doreen." I sat at the kitchen table and read all 11 letters from a woman named Caroline Beaumont, who had been 19 years old in the spring of 1990, and who had written to her aunt in Ohio about a baby she had given birth to in March in a hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, and who could not, she said over and over again in increasingly desperate handwriting, keep her. Her own mother had thrown her out. The baby's father had returned to college in another state and would not answer her letters. She was sleeping on a friend's couch. She was working a shift at a diner that ran from 4 in the afternoon to midnight. The baby cried, she wrote, in a way she did not know how to soothe. Aunt Doreen, I am so tired. Aunt Doreen, I do not know what I am doing. Aunt Doreen, please. The 11th letter was dated May 30th, 1990, and it was the shortest. Aunt Doreen, yes, come and get her. I cannot. Please come. Caroline. I read all 11 letters. Then I sat with my hands flat on the kitchen table for a long time and tried to make my breathing even. Caroline Beaumont was Doreen's niece, not her sister. The relationship was real. Doreen had been her father's older sister, a half-sister actually, from a first marriage I had never heard about, which explained why the last names did not match. Caroline's father, Doreen's half-brother, had died young, and Caroline had been raised by her mother and a stepfather in a town outside Asheville, and she had only met Doreen a handful of times at family funerals. But she had remembered her. She had remembered the calm woman in the men's flannel shirt who had stood at the back of the church at her father's funeral and had said almost nothing and had given her, a 12-year-old girl, a steady hand on the shoulder that she had never forgotten. 7 years later, when she was 19 and alone in Asheville with a baby she could not feed, that hand on the shoulder was the only one she could remember. The third divider was labeled Elaine. Elaine Whitlock had existed. She had been Doreen's full sister. She had lived in Cleveland. She had struggled with addiction. She had died, and this part was the only part of the original story that was true, in a motel bathroom in Cleveland in the fall of 2001, when I was 11 years old. The death certificate was in the file. So was a small handful of photographs of Elaine, taken at family gatherings in the 1980s, a dark-haired woman with Doreen's jaw and a tired smile. Elaine had never had a child. She had never been pregnant. She had not been my mother. She had simply died at the right time to give Doreen a story that she could tell me when I was old enough to start asking. A story that would close the door on my real mother for good. The fourth divider was thicker than the others. It was labeled Caroline, 1990 to 2024. I opened it last because some part of me already knew what was in it, and I needed a minute before I looked. There were 34 letters, one for almost every year of my life. They were all in Caroline's handwriting, and the handwriting changed across the decades, the way handwriting does. younger and looser at the beginning, tighter and more careful in the middle, slightly tremored toward the end. Each one was addressed to Doreen at the Birchwood Road address. Each one was about me. Has she started talking yet? Does she sleep through the night? Is she in school? What grade? Does she have friends? What does she like to read? Is she kind? Is she happy? Aunt Doreen, please, just a paragraph, just so I know. Doreen had answered every single one. Carbon copies of her replies were paper-clipped to each incoming letter in the same accordion file organized by year. Caroline. She is well. She is in 3rd grade. Her teacher says she is bright. She has a friend named Lila. She likes peanut butter sandwiches and the color green. She is a good girl. I will write again next year. Doreen. The carbons went on year after year. She started high school. She is on the yearbook. She is taller than me now. She wants to study baking. She got into the community college. She moved to Ohio. She is opening a bakery. She is doing well. She is doing well. She is doing well. The most recent letter was dated September of last year. Caroline's handwriting was small and careful. Aunt Doreen. I am 53 now. I have not married. I have not had other children. I have thought about her every single day for 33 years. I am not asking to be in her life. I am asking only that if something ever happens to you, she be allowed to know I exist. That is all. Please, Caroline. Doreen had paper-clipped a note to the top of it in her own hand, undated. To be honored. I closed the accordion file. I stood up from the kitchen table. I walked to the back porch. I stood there for a long time, looking at the maple tree where the wind chimes were turning. The chimes were the kind that had a low metal sound, almost a tone rather than a tinkle, and Doreen had hung them there the year I turned 13, because I had once told her I did not like the high, cheerful kind. I leaned against the porch railing, and I did not cry. I just stood there with my hands on the wood, and I let the tone of the chimes move through me. In my pocket, my phone buzzed. It was Lila, the same Lila from 3rd grade, my oldest friend, the one Doreen had mentioned in the carbon, texting to ask how I was doing. I did not answer her. I went back inside. I went back to the desk. I opened the small wooden box I had not opened yet. Inside, on a folded square of cotton, was a hospital bracelet. Pink. Beaumont. Margaret C.F. 6 pounds, 4 ounces. March 14th, 90. And underneath the bracelet, an address on an index card, written in Doreen's hand and recently, the ink still bright. Caroline Beaumont, 412 Sycamore Lane, Asheville, North Carolina, and a phone number, and a single sentence underneath in Doreen's writing. Margaret, the choice is yours. Either one is right. Doreen. I went into the kitchen. I did not call the number. Not yet. I sat at the table. I did the math. Caroline had been 19 when she gave me up. She had written to Doreen for 34 years. She had asked exactly once that I be allowed to know she existed. And Doreen, who had loved me and raised me and built a life around me, had also, for 23 years, held this woman's letters in a locked drawer and had not told me, and had also written to be honored on the most recent one, and had also left me the address. Doreen had not made the decision for me. She had made the decision possible. Carl, the neighbor, came by that evening with a casserole. I did not tell him what I had found. He sat in the living room for half an hour and told me stories about my Aunt Doreen, about a hailstorm in 1996, about a fox that had gotten into her chickens in 2003, about the time she had driven a stranger's car out of a snowbank on Birchwood Road in February without ever introducing herself to the stranger. He left around 8. I locked the door behind him. I went upstairs to the room that had been mine, and I slept for 11 hours. In the morning, I called Lila. I told her almost everything. She was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Margaret, what do you want to do?" I said, "I do not know." She said, "Take your time. The address is not going anywhere." I said, "Lila, I think I want to drive down there." She said, "Then drive down there, but call her first. Do not be the woman who shows up on a stranger's porch unannounced after 34 years. That is a movie. This is your life." I said, "Lila." She said, "Margaret, what?" I said, "What if she does not want me?" Lila was quiet again. Then she said, "Margaret, she wrote 34 letters. She is not going to not want you." I called the number that night. It rang 4 times. A woman's voice answered, low and careful. "Hello?" I said, "Is this Caroline Beaumont?" She said, "Yes. Who is this?" I said, "Caroline. My name is Margaret." There was a silence so long I thought the line had dropped. Then I heard her draw in a breath, the kind of breath you draw when something you have been holding in your hands for 34 years has just shifted. She said, "Margaret, oh." She said, "Is Doreen?" I said, "She passed away 2 weeks ago." Caroline made a sound that was not crying and was not speaking. It was something between. I waited. I let her have it. After a minute, she said, "She wrote me last in August. She said she was tired." I said, "I found your letters, all of them, and the carbons, and the address she left for me." Caroline said, "Oh." Then she said, "Margaret, I am not going to ask you for anything. I am not going to ask you for anything ever. Whatever you want is what we do." I said, "I want to come and meet you, if that is okay." She said, "When?" I said, "Saturday." She said, Yes, Saturday, yes." I drove down on Saturday morning. It was a 10-hour drive. I left at 4 a.m. with Pearl in her carrier on the passenger seat and the pink hospital bracelet zipped into the inside pocket of my jacket and a thermos of coffee Doreen had taught me how to make. 3 scoops, cold water, never cheap beans. I crossed 3 state lines. I listened to the local AM stations until they faded out, and then I let the radio go quiet. I thought for the entire drive about Doreen. I thought about her in the kitchen at the table with her highlighter. I thought about her in the back bedroom with the bottom drawer locked. I thought about her writing those carbon copies year after year to a woman who had given me to her, telling that woman that I was well, that I was kind, that I was happy. I thought about how she had decided somewhere in the last year of her life that I was old enough, or that she was tired enough, to leave the door open. I thought about the fact that she had not opened it for me. She had only handed me the key. The town was small and tucked into the mountains. The address was a small green house with a porch and a planter of marigolds and a wind chime. A wind chime hanging from the porch beam. I parked on the street. I sat in the car for 2 minutes. Then I got out, and I walked up the path, and the door opened before I reached it. Caroline Beaumont was 53 years old. She was small and dark-haired and going gray at the temples, and her eyes were my eyes. I had not been ready for that part. She stood on the porch, and she looked at me for a long moment, and she did not move. Then she said very quietly, "Margaret, may I?" And I said, "Yes." She held me on the porch for a long time. She did not say anything. She did not cry exactly. She just held on, and I held on back. We sat in her kitchen for 6 hours. She had made coffee. She had bought a coffee cake from the bakery in town, which she apologized for because she had wanted to bake, but she had been too nervous all morning to measure anything correctly. I told her about Doreen, about the bakery in Ohio, about Pearl, about the cookbooks with the notes in the margins. She told me about her life. She had become a nurse. She worked at a hospital in Asheville. She had never married, but she had a long-time partner named Joan, who taught middle school art and who came home that afternoon and met me with the careful gentleness of a woman who had been instructed by her partner not to make any sudden moves. Caroline showed me a wall in her hallway. It had 33 framed photographs on it, all of the same person. Me. School photos, yearbook photos, a photo of me at my high school graduation, a photo of me cutting the ribbon at my bakery's opening 3 years ago. Doreen had sent every one. I stood in front of that wall and I looked at 33 years of myself, displayed by a woman I had met that morning, and I did not say anything for a long time. And Caroline stood next to me and did not say anything either. And Pearl, in her carrier in the kitchen, made a small sound that meant she was hungry and ready to go home. I want to pause here. If you have ever stood in a hallway and seen yourself in someone else's pictures, drop one word in the comments. Just one. I will read every one of them. I stayed in Asheville for 4 days. We did not try to make up for 34 years. We did not pretend to. We had breakfast at her kitchen table. We took 2 long walks. She drove me to the hospital where I had been born, and we stood in the parking lot, and she pointed at a window on the 3rd floor, and she said, "That was the room." She did not cry. I did not either. I drove home on a Wednesday. I called her on Sunday. I called her the next Sunday. I have called her every Sunday since. The harder part came after. I went back to the farmhouse on Birchwood Road for 2 more weeks. I finished going through Doreen's things. I called the lawyer she had retained, a man named Bishop in the county seat, and we walked through her will. The farmhouse was mine. The Buick was mine. A small investment account she had built out of teaching salaries and frugal Saturdays for 50 years was mine. About $230,000, which was more money than I had ever seen in one place at one time. There were also 2 specific bequests: $5,000 to Carl, the neighbor, for the plowing, and $5,000 to Caroline Beaumont for the letters. Mr. Bishop did not ask me about the second one. He had drafted the will. He already knew. I did not sell the farmhouse. I could not. I had Carl agree to keep an eye on it. I drove back to Ohio. I opened the bakery on the Tuesday after I got back because I had a maple loaf order for a wedding on Saturday, and I do not break commitments. I did not tell my customers about Doreen. I did not tell them about Caroline. I told Lila, and Lila told nobody, because Lila has been my friend since 3rd grade, and she knows how to hold a thing. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, I drove the Buick to the farmhouse, and I went into the back bedroom, and I took the green accordion file off the desk, and I drove it down to Asheville. Caroline opened the door. I handed it to her on the porch. I said, "These are yours. They were always yours." She held the file with both hands. She said, "Margaret, are you sure?" I said, "Doreen kept them safe for 34 years. Now you can keep them. I have read them. I do not need to keep them. They were a record of your asking, and you do not need to be reminded of how long you asked. You already know." She held the file against her chest. She nodded once. She stepped aside. We made coffee. Joan came home. We had dinner. I drove home the next day. In December, Caroline came to Ohio for the first time. She slept in my apartment above the bakery on the pull-out couch. Pearl, who does not like strangers, sat on her lap on the second day. I taught Caroline how to shape a sourdough boule. She was clumsy at it, the way nurses sometimes are with dough. Too much pressure, too much haste. I laughed at her. She laughed at herself. She took home a jar of starter in her carry-on bag, and at the airport security line, she had to explain to a TSA agent what a sourdough mother was, and the agent let her keep it, and she texted me a photo of the jar in the bin next to her shoes. I have not figured everything out. I do not pretend that I have. There are days when I am angry at Doreen, quiet days, slow days, where I sit in the back bedroom of the farmhouse, which I now visit 1 weekend a month, and I open the bottom drawer, and I look at the empty space where the accordion file used to be, and I think, you should have told me sooner. There are also days when I understand exactly why she did not. I was 11 when Elaine died. I was 14 when Uncle Pete died. I was 17 when I tried to get a copy of my birth certificate at the community college, and the registrar said the name on file was Beaumont, not Whitlock. And I went home and I asked Doreen, and Doreen, who did not lie, said, "Margaret, that is a clerical thing. We will fix it." And I, who was 17 and tired and only wanted to start school, had let her fix it. I had never asked again. Some part of me must have known. Some part of me must have decided not to know. Doreen had been holding the door for me. I had not been ready to walk through it. By the time I might have been ready, she had been tired, and she had been 70, and she had built me a life I loved. And the door had stayed shut a year longer, and a year longer, and a year longer, until her heart finally made the decision for both of us. I was angry about this for 1 week. Then I was not angry about it anymore. Because being angry at Doreen was like being angry at the foundation of the house I lived in. The foundation had cracks. The house was still standing. The house was still mine. I called Caroline on the Sunday after that, and I told her I had been angry, and I told her I was not anymore, and I told her I was glad she had asked in that last letter that I be allowed to know. I told her that the asking was what had cracked the door open. I told her that without the asking, Doreen might have taken everything to the grave. Caroline was quiet on the phone for a minute. Then she said, "Margaret, I asked every year for 34 years. The last one was just the one she answered." I said, "I know." She said, "I am glad I asked too." In April, almost 6 months after Doreen died, I drove down to Asheville for a long weekend. Caroline and Joan had a cookout in the backyard. Caroline's neighbor came over with a guitar. A friend of Joan's brought a salad. Caroline introduced me to all of them by my name, just Margaret. Not my daughter, not my niece, not anything that required explaining. I had asked her to do it that way. She had agreed without argument. The neighbor played a song I did not know. I sat in a folding chair in the grass with a paper plate on my knee, and at one point I looked up, and Caroline was looking at me from across the yard, and she lifted her glass just slightly, and I lifted mine back. That was all. Nobody else saw it. We did not need them to. I drove home Sunday night. I unlocked the bakery on Monday at 5 in the morning the way I do every Monday. I started the ovens. I pulled the starter out of the fridge, the same starter Caroline had taken home in her carry-on, only she had since sent some of it back in a little jar with a hand-labeled lid, and I fed it. I made the dough for the day's bread. I opened at 7. The first customer was a woman named Beth, who comes in every weekday for a coffee and a croissant on her way to the bus. And she said, "How was your weekend, Margaret?" And I said, "It was good, Beth. It was good." And I meant it. Some houses you inherit. Some houses you build. Some doors you open. Some doors stay closed your whole life. I had an aunt who was not my aunt, and a mother who was not my mother, and a mother I did not know I had. I had a woman named Doreen who loved me for 23 years and lied to me about exactly one thing, and left me the key to the lie in the bottom drawer of an oak desk because she could not bring herself to say it out loud and could not bring herself to take it to the grave. I had a woman named Caroline who wrote 34 letters and asked exactly once to be allowed to exist in my world. I had a friend named Lila who told me at the right moment to call before I drove. I had a cat named Pearl. I had a bakery. I had a record player. I had a farmhouse on a road called Birchwood that I would visit one weekend a month for the rest of my life. I had 2 mothers. The dead one had told the truth in writing, even when she could not say it out loud. The living one had asked the right question every year for 34 years and had then at last been answered. I am 34 years old. My name is Margaret Caroline. I answer to both halves now. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Have you ever found something in a drawer that changed the shape of your life? Or maybe you are still waiting to ask the question you have been carrying for years. Drop it in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them. There are more stories like this on this channel. The link is in the description. Thank you for listening. I mean that.